Did you get lunch? Yes. How many of you are fasting for Easter? Anybody? You are. Here in Russia, what do you have to give up? It's just meat. Okay. Yeah, in Greece where I live, it's about the same thing. And then the last week it gets really strict. So in the last week there's no oil, no cheese, no reason to live, nothing. And then on Easter Sunday, everybody eats huge amounts. And a lot of people end up in hospital. And that's true in Greece because for Greeks, Easter is a big holiday. It's bigger than Christmas, it's the big holiday. And they roast whole lamb, not whole lamp, as my students used to write. At Easter we eat a whole lamp, including the bulb. And they roast the whole lamb, and then everyone just overeats. And after so many weeks of fasting, your stomach gets a bit smaller and your body is less used to eating. And people have heart attacks, and they end up in hospital, and they all go, "It was worth it." It's just different. So I tend not to fast, but I don't eat so much on Easter Sunday. Anyway, that's before us. We have to work before we get there. I was just letting people come in, that's what I was doing. In this afternoon, this first session, we will be looking at ESP, not extrasensory perception. That would be a clairvoyance conference, but English for specific purposes. And what I wanted to do was, in some ways, to take you on the journey that we went through as a company when we were exploring this idea of English for specific purposes. I'm not going to just talk about books, but it is a journey that we went through with authors, with our editing teams, and generally trying to put together a course that would be of use to people teaching English for specific purposes. I presume those of you who are here are involved in some way in teaching English for specific purposes. If not, you're probably in the wrong room. And if you can't understand me, you probably should be in the French or the German ones. So, could I ask to start the ball rolling and have a bit of a discussion? With a microphone you walk around, you feel like a television presenter. It's just a bit weird. What kind of stuff are you teaching, ladies and gentlemen? What subjects? If you're doing ESE, what professions? What professions are you teaching? Engineering, thank you. IT. I'm sorry, someone over here? Sorry, I could hear I couldn't hear the rest of it. My apologies. The sound is not as good as I expected. Thank you. Doctors, thank you. And medicine, yeah? Anyone else? Okay, so professions. Interestingly enough, in the first presentation this morning, they were talking, for example, about English for taxi drivers, which is an issue in some countries. And what we were looking at when we started thinking about getting involved in the world of ESP was to try and look at all the kinds of English for specific purposes that get taught. It is a very, very big field. Much bigger, I'll be honest with you, than we initially anticipated. So it's not just the business. Medicine also is quite popular. Medicine, nursing, this kind of thing. But it is things like IT is a big one these days, engineering, but also things like taxi drivers. As I said, beauty salon is one of our popular ones, agriculture, and things like this. So what we have found is that colleagues, ladies and gentlemen like yourselves, are very much at the forefront of this new push in terms of English as a foreign language for vocational purposes. because it comes as part of, if we're talking about 21st century education, this idea of vocational education has been revisited over the last few years. Because governments have realized that in order for people to be able to have a professional working life, they need some kind of training. That university is a wonderful place, but it's not necessarily for everyone. And from my own family's experience, I know that to be true. I went to university, my little sister went to university, but my two brothers didn't. But, don't judge them. One of the second brother, I'm the eldest of course, it shows. The second one, the one after me, is a jeweler. He makes jewelry, he doesn't just sell it, he doesn't just do retail, he actually creates and designs jewelry, which he sells at very good prices, especially to the family. He's a good businessman. And my little brother, who is a chef, and has worked in a number of different places, all of which he's done very well in, etc. So, from my own experience, I'm a big fan of vocational education. My two brothers fell into it by accident. It really was a series of very serendipity, very fortunate accidents. And they're both in positions now where they're very happy in their work, and certainly earning more than enough to feed their families and do all the things that they wish to do. Obviously, we'd all like more money. But they are in a comfortable position without going to university. They would not have stood university, I think, or maybe university would not have survived them. I'm not very sure which. But vocational education, thankfully now in the UK, as well as in many other countries, is something that is being looked at again. And of course, in non-English speaking countries, vocational education also includes a section which is English for that specific vocation. In fact, in the UK, they could probably do with that as well, because a lot of English people don't really know how to speak English either, but never mind that now. Although I have come across some teachers of English for vocation in the UK who are working with recently arrived immigrants, and they're also looking for vocational language as well. So it's not, even in the UK, there is some drive behind it. Now what we found was, to get back to the journey, that was the start of the journey as it were, was that there is not a huge amount of methodological help when you're looking at English for specific purposes. Most of the references you will find are to these two publications, Developments in English for Specific Purposes, Study Evans and St. John, and English for Specific Purposes, Hutchinson and Water. And you'll notice the date on both of them. In fact, both of them essentially predate things like the widespread use of the internet. Although I'm not, by the way, they're terribly well written and the methodology is basically sound, but they were from a very different era, a very different way of doing things. And when I was researching this for my own purposes, it was very hard for me to find reliable sources discussing the teaching of vocational English other than these two. Now, if something else has come out recently that I haven't had time to find, I will stand corrected quite happily and will quite happily read it. But about a year or so ago, it was still very much in these areas. And what I wanted to talk about to start off with in this session is thinking a little bit, because we're looking at moving forward in this conference, is to look a bit at how we've had a change in even vocational language teaching. And I wanted to discuss some of those with you just to start off with. So let's have the slide, there we go. What tended to happen, certainly in the past, was that most vocational English tended to focus on these areas for business purposes. A lot of it was there. And this tended to be taught to people who are already in, I'll mention this again a little later on, but people who are already in their profession. People who were already established or had certainly started their career and were looking for English to add to their resume as it were. They were looking for maybe a way of advancing themselves within the company they were working for. But they tended to be professionals already in a field. The trend these days has been very much, I thought I had an arrow there, I don't, over to here, which is English for occupational or English for vocational purposes. Not much difference. As far as terminology goes, let's use them both equally. English for professional purposes as well, but that's just snobbish. Because professionals have clients. Tell you who has clients, but there are ladies in the room, and I'm not going to say it. Lawyers. Anyway. I'm being naughty because it's midday. So, what we have found is a big shift, and that shift has not only been in terms of the language, but it's very much the environment has changed. And again, we will be looking at this in a little more detail later on. The shift has come from professionals in careers to very much younger people starting or pre-career. So you've got people in technical colleges, this kind of age group, who are not necessarily so academically inclined. And I think that's fair. So what you've moved from is it's a very different kind of environment from individuals in this bracket to individuals here. And our experience has been that most English for vocational or occupational purposes is being taught in that kind of technical college environment at the moment. Obviously there's still a market for this, but this is where the bulk of it's being done. And I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, ladies and gentlemen, this is where most of you are teaching? Yeah, what age groups are you teaching? So like university level, technical college level? You teaching older, younger? Teaching younger. This is what I hoped. That worked. I've been to Russia before, it's okay. But it's always good to check, and it's polite to check. So, and your experience is going to be that the majority of your learners are, in terms of their English, are probably going to be B1 maximum. Many of them will be in the kind of A2-ish kind of range. Is that fair? In other words, they're not particularly good at English when they come to you. Is that, and obviously there will be exceptions, so I accept that. And those are the lovely moments in life. But the majority of your learners are going to be not highly academically inclined, quite low level of English individuals. This is, again, it's a generalization, but it'll be useful for conversational purposes. So, and we're aware of that, and it's not just you, by the way. There are other countries where it's exactly the same. So the changes that we have noticed, apart from the environment, and that is, again, something we'll zoom back to a little later on, are from the traditional model. Let's get the traditional model up on the board. The traditional model, going back to the methodology I drew to your attention before, kind of has these three basic axes. So you've got who needs the language, why do they need it, when are they going to use it, where are they going to need it. Essentially, you're looking at what's called a needs analysis, which again we'll refer to. So you did your needs analysis, and based on that, you decided what language you were going to teach. Okay? And based on that, you kind of thought how you were going to teach it. Now, how you're going to teach it was usually fairly straightforward. It tended to be lots of native level text that was analyzed and possibly translated and really enjoyed by everybody involved. But that was a big problem, especially when you remember the new audience for English for vocational purposes that I'm talking about. When you're looking at business people who are driven, who are highly motivated, or at least financially motivated because better job, blah, 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 they are more likely going to sit and engage with a difficult text, a text with a lot of terminology, etc. But what that meant was that the teacher essentially had no control over the progress of that language. What happens now, apart from the kind of environment I've mentioned, is that you're also having to think of other things because methodology has moved on. It is now no longer enough just to sit and kind of do the grammar translation side of things. As modern educators, we are being asked to think about things like, yes, of course, what language, but also thinking about things like culture. I mentioned that this morning in my introduction, and it was mentioned in the first presentation. This idea of awareness of culture, cultural sensitivity, matters. Because if I get it wrong, my communication fails. And not just at vocational level, but professional level as well, and at business level. So when we think about teaching ESP these days, there is an element of looking at cultural mobility, as it were, of being able to take our language around different cultures. And also, because education has moved further forward, we have this idea of learning skills, of remembering that our learners, especially at the level you ladies and gentlemen are teaching, they still need help in things like learning to learn, organizing their work, organizing revision, coming back to things. Yeah. So all of these things have been added to the mixing pot. So when we're choosing our methodology now, it's not just a question of how do I teach the language, it's also how do I do the other stuff as well. Yeah. So there's now a much broader mix of things that teachers are being asked to do. This is what I wanted to show you. But I have to change the sound. Give me a second, I just realized I rushed in and had to set up very, very quickly because I was late. So I need to change that. It's just a sound setting I have to change, and I need to steal that and put that in there. And I have to deafen you because that's a rule. Sorry about that. Especially those of you who are trying to doze off. You can doze off again in a second. Let me just see if it's now working. Can you hear that? Okay. So now I just have to wait for my computer to stop it.
The English believe it's a slur on your host's food if you don't clear your plate. Whereas the Chinese feel you're questioning their generosity if you do. At HSBC, we never underestimate the importance of local knowledge. Which is why we have local banks staffed by local people in over 80 countries across the globe. HSBC, the world's local bank.
Sorry about HSBC, good advertising there. But about culture. Yeah, when I was a kid in the UK, we were always taught you should eat whatever's put in front of you. That's polite. Now, apparently in China, you're supposed to leave a bit to indicate that you're full, thank you very much indeed, so the host doesn't have to worry. These things matter, especially if you're eating something you particularly dislike. But my grandmother had a great philosophy. She used to, no longer with us sadly, but she used to say, if you don't think you can eat all of it, eat the most expensive bit first. Because my grandmother's philosophy was if you were going to leave it, it was a shame to leave like the meat or whatever someone had paid lots of money for. Potatoes were a bit cheaper. So even now when I eat, I tend to start with the expensive stuff first. I'm looking at my plate trying to work out what cost what. Grandmothers have great influence. But as somebody who travels a lot and who goes around, I do or have learned the value of culture and of how things are done. People are very nice, they're normally not that shocked. They understand you're a foreigner. But you have to remember, and the last point I wanted to make on this before we move on, that cultural sensitivity is not a conscious thing. It's a subconscious and an unconscious thing. So for example, a linguistic example, and I use it quite frequently because it's very simple and very straightforward. If you go into a shop in the UK and you say, the shopkeeper says, "Good morning, customer." And you go, "Good morning, dear shopkeeper." And the shopkeeper goes, "What can I do for you this fine, rainy, miserable, cold British morning?" Because you have to talk about the weather in Britain. And as a customer, and as a non-native speaking customer, you go, "Yes, good shopkeeper, I want a newspaper." You've just committed social suicide. Because we never say, "I want." There is no reason why not. It means exactly the right thing. Because traditionally want, by the way, means to lack. In older English, to want is to lack. So what you mean is, I do not have a newspaper. I am wanting a newspaper, so please deal with it. But the shopkeeper, in his brain or her brain, is now going, "Oh, you want, do you? Well, you know what want did." There's lots of English expressions making fun of people who say they want things. And the shopkeeper will understand you, and you will get your newspaper. And the shopkeeper will be going, "It's okay, he's a foreigner." But subconsciously, he'll be going, "He's a very rude foreigner." And those are the kinds of things that you cannot easily get around. This is why it matters, because when we think about communication, we have to think about it on a level further than the literal lexical. We have to look at the totality of communication in all branches of language teaching. But for people who are maybe going to be dealing with customers, who are going to be trying to sell something, who are going to be making a living using their language, it's possibly even more important. If you're a tourist, you don't care, because they're selling you and they need your custom. When you're trying to sell, it's a different thing altogether. So that's why cultural sensitivity is important, and it was a fun video, and I just like sharing it with people. YouTube is a great resource these days when you want to find things to show in presentations. Okay, let's have a think a little bit about the different environments in which it's taught and the change in those environments and what that has meant. Yes, no, excellent. Certainly we have to think about the different variables that could affect the way English for specific purposes is taught. It is not, although the audience, the standard audience, is increasingly the one I mentioned, it is still taught in different environments, and that matters. Sometimes, for example, you get very short course. Do any of you work, well, you don't have to admit it, whatever, but places like private language schools, for example, quite often run short courses for business people. And if you work for a private language school and you don't do that, maybe you should think about it. Because what may happen then is they send teachers out to businesses, or businesses send their staff to the language school to brush up their language over a short course. Participants do still vary, very much in the private sector. They vary. They can be anything from 15-year-olds to 45, 50-year-old business people. I once taught a very nice gentleman who was the head of Weller Hair Products. He was their head in Greece. He was their manager, the chief. I learned all kinds of things about the hair care profession from him during the lessons, which is why you should never buy hair products from your hairdresser, because they make there's a lot of profit. Always buy your hair products from the supermarket. You're getting much better value for money. Just so you know, at least when you leave today, you will have learned something useful. So, from me at least, everyone else is talking much more sense. So, group size is, how many, for those of you, well, all of you, how many students would you have in your groups, ladies and gentlemen? As a matter of interest, just for me to know. 10 to 15. Anyone over 15? 15, 18. You could just bump off a few, lock them in a cupboard. How many? 50? You know, I have been to countries where they teach 50 students. I mean, not vocational language, but in South America, and I'm not talking in poor places, even in posh schools, 40 to 50 students is quite normal. Just think of that when you're feeling you're having a bad day. They have no time to teach. By the time you get 40 to 50 kids in, you get them sat down, you get them quiet. It's time to get them up and leave again. That's all you do, all day. That's their education, working their leg muscles. That's all it is. But certainly group size change. Some of the more private institutions tend to have much smaller groups. But we also had to think about how to arrange the material. What we found was there is no particular rule on that. There is a massive range of ESP size classrooms, and even where it's taught. Now, most of you are working in institutions, but these days there's a lot of English language being taught at the place of work. It makes a lot of sense for businesses to bring a teacher to them so that the staff are all in the same place. And this happens, to my knowledge, as well for some hotels. So that because they've got the staff there, they bring the teacher in, they know the staff are going, and the staff don't have to take too much time off work, what have you. They can provide the facilities, the teacher comes in and does the work. The advantage of that as well, I'll mention in just a few moments. And this is one of the biggest changes as well that we've seen, is that there are many more learners, on this side of the equation. Yeah? This is the side that we talked about earlier on, the professionals, already experts. They know what they're doing, they know their business. Here they're using English as a tool to move forward in work, and they're more likely to have finished formal education. Increasingly, it's over here. Because your issue is here, not only are they academically not finished, they're also not trained in their new profession. Because they're learning both at the same time. So some of you mentioned, for example, engineering. They're learning to be engineers, and they're learning the English of engineering together. Whereas under the older style, they would already be, let's say, engineers, and they would have a clearer idea about the language they need. That has been a big change, moving over to this side, because it's meant that we can't take it for granted that they are truly 100% professional yet. And that's meant that the language we teach them has to change slightly. Now, in terms of needs analysis, do you do needs analysis, or do you just kind of run with it? It's an interesting point. Stop it. Let's ask you this for a second, because it would be nice to get your input as well. How do you decide what you teach in your ESP classes, your vocational classes? How is that decision made? Do you just get the book? We have no problem with that. I work for a publisher. That's not a bad thing. Or do you have another process that you go through? And I'm asking that as a teacher now, not as a publisher. How do you decide what to teach? If you're teaching your engineers or your IT students or your doctors or whoever, how do you decide what English to teach them? You have the book. Certainly for medical professionals, you're going to find that not easy, but you're going to find it more straightforward to find that material. And nursing as well tends to, there's quite a bit of available literature. But what about your IT guides or your engineers or whoever else? I'm sorry, again? From their needs. But who tells you their needs? That's what I'm trying to get to. The students tell you that. So fine, this is okay. I wasn't trying to get to a particular answer, I was just genuinely curious. So you sit with your learners and you discuss the language they need. But my question there is for those of you who are teaching, for example, people who are learning to be engineers, for argument's sake. How do they know what language they need? How do you make that decision? You just don't. Okay.
Choose the materials.
So this is, so you get like, the program comes from presumably the teaching staff who teach them engineering or whatever the subject may be. You look at that and you have to kind of fit in with...
We teach some general, so to say, but it's better to teach them what they learn in Russian, so to say.
Okay, so you try and match what is being taught in their other lessons.
Yes.
as in there with their other instructors. Okay, this is a very important point. Thank you very much, Matt. This kind of matching, and this is, excuse me, this is why it's very hard work, ESP, because you can't just decide on your own what you have to do. You have to kind of follow along with what they are doing in their other lessons, and that has proven to be quite difficult. It's easier nowadays with the internet, but certainly in the past there were several hours of preparation for 1 hour of English teaching. These days it's much faster. But certainly if you're looking at your needs analysis, just a couple of notes about that. Obviously what do they need to do with English is the language of engineering, to talk about this, to talk about that. But also you have to think about the skills they need to develop. And this is something that we realized wasn't always being taken into consideration in our kind of learning experience, was that as language teachers in general, we tend to favor the kind of even-handed approach when looking at the four major skill areas: reading, writing, listening, speaking. Now it is arguable that they are not all necessary for every profession. So for example, if you take one of the examples I gave, like a beauty salon or taxi driver, is a taxi driver ever going to have to write a composition entitled "The Advantages and Disadvantages of the One-Way System in Krasnoярsk"? They're never going to be asked to do that. So is it worth teaching them to do it? I'm guessing not. So this is one of the things we face. Actually, we faced it on a number of levels, because not only do we provide material for vocational English, we also are working on providing exams for vocational English. And this idea of the skills that they need to master is quite a demanding one. Because if you're looking, for example, at English for doctors, doctors may well have to write quite long reports on patients, like their transfer notes, if you're going from hospital to hospital or whatever it may happen to be. There's a number of occasions where a doctor may have to write quite an extensive report, but a taxi driver never would. Or if you're working in a beauty salon, or even in a hotel, or a bank maybe, depending on your job in the bank. Yeah. So what we have to think about very carefully, it's not only the language, but which of the skills we're going to emphasize. Which are they going to use most? This is why, well, I'll come on to advice in a second. Which genres do they need to master? So what are they going to be reading or listening to? What kinds of things are they going to get input from? And how are they going to produce? Is it going to be mostly speaking? Sometimes it may be written more. Sometimes it may be a balance. But we really have to think about those to make our language relevant to our learners. And that does require a little bit of research on our account. Another thing that we need to do, and I think this is forgotten sometimes, is also to look at a situational analysis. Not just look at what they need, blah, 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 skill, genre, but look at, in terms of our language, the general classroom situation, 3 basic areas, what we call target situation, learning situation, and present situation. And these are, where do I need to get my learners to be? What do I need to teach them? What are they good at? In other words, what are their preferences, their learning styles, etc., educationally? Are they good at listening, speaking, writing, whatever it may happen to be? And also I need to know where we are, what they've learned already. And quite often that can be a mixed bag in vocational institutions. Quite often they've come from different schools, they've come from different educational backgrounds, and there can be quite a mix. I've spoken to many colleagues in Russia who teach English for specific purposes, who have stressed this concern of a very mixed bag of students arriving at the beginning of every year. Some of whom who had some basic English, some of whom slightly more advanced, and some of whom are not very far advanced at all. And there are do you do, again, I'm going to ask you questions because I can do that at this event. Do you do like a foundation course at all? Or do you just go straight into it? Because this is very relevant to what we're talking about here. So for example, on day one, would you go in and just start trying to teach the language of engineers or whoever it may happen to be? Or do you find out first? Some kind of entry test, maybe? You really, and if you forgive me, you really should. Because you need to know, as I said, quite often at this kind of vocational level, they've come from maybe different schools, different backgrounds, you don't know. And I've come across a lot of colleagues who complain that they get like a few months or weeks into the year, and then they realize that half the class doesn't know what the present simple is, and half the class don't care. No, and half the class are into past perfect continuous, whatever it may happen to be, which you don't necessarily need that much in vocational language, I should stress. But there usually is something of a disparity in terms of their language. It's a very good idea at the beginning of the year, especially with a new group of students, to see where you are. And then, if necessary, do a little bit of foundation work. Please note a little bit. Students who are looking at English for vocational purposes do not need the level of grammatical awareness necessarily that you would if you were taking a C2 level exam. So basically good grammar, a knowledge of subject, verb, object, a knowledge of or awareness of what means today, what means tomorrow, what means yesterday, and then move on. But sometimes you'll find that that isn't even there, but do find it out. Otherwise, you're in trouble. So this kind of needs analysis is not just an analysis of language, it's also analysis of our learners' situation and their needs as well, is something it's highly recommended that you do, especially at the beginning of the year. Also remember, when planning, this is all about planning and learners' needs, etc., to think about, okay, this is fairly straightforward, the kind of text that learners are likely to come across. But also, and this is something that got forgotten under the more traditional models of teaching English for vocational purposes, when we just looked at native level text and analysed it essentially for the vocabulary, for the terminology. There are different levels at which learners have to communicate. If, for example, I'm an IT guy, gotta love them. We have great IT guys in the company, in the office where I work from, but they do communicate at a completely different level to the rest of the world. It is a bit problematic, but we have to, as teachers, prepare our learners for different types of communication. So IT guys will not always be talking with other IT guys, although I think that would be a good idea, if those are the only people they ever spoke to. Because when they start to speak to people like us, it's very humbling. What? Do you ever see there was a television series called The IT Crowd? You saw that, yeah? With the classic line, have you tried turning it off and turning it on again? That was always the advice. Have you tried turning it on and turning it off again? It's a wonderful line. If you haven't seen it, do have a look, because it's brilliant and very well observed. But the point is, if you are a professional in a field, you ladies and gentlemen are an example, as teachers we talk to each other differently than we would, for example, to parents. Doctors talk to each other differently than they would when explaining to, or they should, when explaining to a patient or a patient's relatives the situation. So this isn't a question we have to ask ourselves when we're putting together a course for English for specific purposes, not just the terminology, but which contexts will language be used in, and how will those contexts change how my learner must use the language. And that will happen in most professions. There may be exceptions, but most professions. Even taxi drivers probably have a way of speaking to each other, I don't know. But certainly non-experts are a big part of that. If you're writing the company website, very quick example, if you're responsible for updating the company website, as people do, all companies have websites, and you're going to do it in English, it's one thing to address people in the field, maybe colleagues from other countries who are your partners, your business partners, and you say, yes, the new product S57642 has now been made available. The X67542 is slightly more advanced than the X67541 because it has an extra doodah on the what's it and an extra thingamy on the ujar. And people who now go, oh, that's very exciting. But your customers are going, oh. Just do what Apple does, just add a number, and they get excited all by themselves. It's the new X10. Oh, really? They don't ask what's, they just like the higher number. iPhone victims are all the same, all over the world. But you have to explain to the customer that this new version does this better, or now does this. Whereas your colleagues will look at it in a completely different way. Yeah? So we need to think about the context in which the language is going to be used. I pressed the wrong button. This is the button, my word, that I wanted to press. That's an interesting transition. Anyway, go back to 10 minutes, we should be finished. Teacher as source of knowledge was the old kind of structure. This is how it used to work. So you had, I would come into my classroom, I would be teaching English, I knew everything about English, I knew the rules of grammar, which makes me a kind of Gandalf-like wizard in the classroom. Do you know that the word grammar actually means magic? That a grammary was actually a book of spells? So if you know grammar, in many, many ways, you are a true magician in the true meaning of the word. There's an interesting thing. A lot of people don't know. Of course, in the ESP classroom, quite often the teacher is not the expert in the subject that is being taught. Yes, of course, you're still an expert in English, but you're not an expert in IT or medicine or whatever it may happen to be, or driving a taxi. Although, well, taxi drivers think they're experts in everything, but never mind that now. They have an opinion on most things. And it's usually quite right-wing. What you become, instead of God, is a facilitator. And you know what? That's okay. It's okay not to know everything. Your job is to help your learners organize, to find, to explain where you can. Yes, of course you will look up the terminology. Yes, of course you'll try and stay a couple of steps ahead in the game. But your job now has shifted. They don't expect you to be a doctor. Your job is to help them find their way to, and I think this is actually quite a nice shift. It takes a bit of the weight off your shoulders. And you can just be a teacher, and it's kind of cool. Obviously, you have to know something about it, and maybe plan the course. But really, what you're doing is just organizational. And then you let them get on with it. So it's planning. That your facilitation is planning, helping them with resources, where to find resources, etc. That, I believe, is a healthy shift in education generally. Just a couple more points, ladies and gentlemen, then we're done, and my colleague Marina will be talking to you. Saving some of the bigger questions for last. Real or not so real? Now, one of the problems we faced when we were thinking about getting involved in this area was this question. Our awareness was that most ESP, vocational English, is being taught in the context we established earlier on. Therefore, how fair was it to present learners with texts that are 100% native level? Because remember, A1, A2, even B1 is not native level language ability. So we took the decision to do something. Now this is a text from Wikipedia on soil erosion. And here in red are what I believe, this is my call, my decision, to be the topic-specific terminology. So if I were teaching a course on things like agriculture or land management or whatever it may happen to be, these are the words I would consider very specific to that particular job. Things like sediment control, sediment basins, water runoff, yeah? Environmental reclamation. I have no idea what these are. Okay? So, those are the words I'd have to teach. The problem is that they are sandwiched in to all of this. And my problem is, if all of this language is essentially native speaker level, it's a little too much. So we took the decision when we were putting together our series, and this is why I chose that, is that what's called the carrier text. The carrier text is the non-terminological text. We simplified it. We felt that was a fair approach, and we highly recommend that this is an approach you take. Because if you're going to present your learners with native level text, they're not going to get anything. They're not going to understand the native level text, they're not going to pick up the terminology. We don't mess around with, we decided obviously not to mess around with the terminology, and you can see it there. Yeah? But the text around it was simplified. Because we found that that wasn't being done, and we thought that was a bad idea. And in terms of production as well, what level do we expect? Now, this depends a little bit on the profession, but I think we have to be fair. There is no reason that, for example, a taxi driver, let's say, or a beautician, should spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, and money and money and money and money, getting to C2 level. It's really, honestly, it's not necessary. It's wonderful if they can, but it's not necessary. And it's very hard for us as teachers to let go of that. We want everybody to be up here. And I'm not suggesting for a second that our aim is mediocrity. I'm not suggesting that for a minute, please don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting laziness, I'm not suggesting anything like that. I am suggesting that when we have a limited time to teach learners who maybe are not the most motivated in the world, we have to make decisions. Trying to get learners who do not need C2 level to C2 level is a waste of time. If they are motivated enough, as time goes on, they will by themselves, if I have taught them properly to use resources, to keep learning on their own, to be autonomous, when they've left my loving tender care and they go out into the big bad world, there's still plenty of opportunity for them to read texts online, to watch things on YouTube, to attend conferences and things like this. It doesn't mean it stops, but I have to make choices and I have to be fair about those. To be honest, a B2 level is more than enough for many, many professions. There's a term that floats around called English for restricted purposes, which sounds like English for spies, but it's not. And I would tell you what it is, but then I'd have to kill you. No, that's not true either. I may just kill you anyway. No, it's after lunch, I can't be bothered. So, English for restricted purposes was, for example, things like people working, selling train tickets. When you're selling train tickets and you have to be quite quick, there's a very limited range of English you actually need. You know, here it is, platform number 30, train's been cancelled, sorry. So what do I do now? Oh, no hablo inglés. Because that's what happened to me. They were doing fine until I learned the train had cancelled, then suddenly their English disappeared. It's funny, that happens at airports a lot as well. People in airports are very nice and very helpful. The minute that the flight is cancelled, and you're trying to find out, everyone stops speaking English. Very helpful. Many countries. But what we have to decide, and that would be your call in your institution, is what level they need to get to. Now with, for example, doctors and lawyers, it's arguable that they need to get to a higher level. But some professions, in all honesty, don't. And in some professions, a proficiency in reading, maybe, is more necessary than a proficiency in speaking, or vice versa. If you're a tourist guide, most of your reading is going to be in your own language. You know, if you're taking people on tour around Krasnoyarsk, whatever, you'll read Russian sources, and you'll explain it in English. So your skill there that you need is reading in Russian, speaking in English. So these are all decisions that you have to make. It's not easy, but they need to be made in the classroom before you actually start getting into it. Oh yeah, one more thing, and then I'll hand you over. Because I should have started at 20 past, so we'll be okay now. Final thing I wanted to mention as well, before handing you over, is this idea of not just thinking about the language, when we're thinking about cultural concerns. And social linguistics, pragmatics, etc. So we have to think about, obviously, the words we use. That matters, but not straightforward as you think. As I've mentioned already, if I'm speaking to an expert, I may use lots of terminology. If I'm speaking to a non-expert, I'm going to lower that level, explain things in more simple language, without being overly patronizing. I think the worst thing you can do, for example, if you're a doctor speaking to a patient or some relatives, is make them feel like they're stupid. So as well as being sick, you're stupid as well. What a bad day that is. Yeah, so there's an art to communicating information. The way things are said, again, it's difficult to find that balance sometimes, especially in the medical profession. If you're giving bad news, for example. But if you're giving bad news and, oh dear, sorry, come back. You don't want to get too emotional about it. At the same time, you shouldn't seem too cold. That's a very fine line to walk. Nurses' exams and things like that, they do look at that, interestingly. But even in the teaching profession, if you have a problem with a student, how you talk to their parents or whoever's responsible to them matters, not just what you say. John is stupid. And how you say it. Do you say it in a John is stupid? No, not even that phrase. Whatever you're saying about John, John is having issues. I mean, he's stupid, obviously. No child is stupid. So, but how you say it, how do you talk to the parents? How do you manage to have that conversation, maybe without them getting offended? Of course, you'd be having it in Russian, but you get the point. And body language is something as well. So these days, when we're looking at ESP, it's not just a question of reading the texts. It's a question of the people skills, the soft skills I mentioned this morning. They are equally important in the modern world of teaching English for vocational purposes. We don't stick on the language, we look at how we have conversations. And we look at conversations, if you can, we tried it as well, in different kinds of contexts. So again, you have the conversations between people of different status, native to non-native, non-native to non-native as well, an expert to non-expert. Playing around with all of those is a very, very important part of that whole process. Now, just to finish with, I've mentioned, because we have to pay the rent, in the past, people tended to go to these resources, the internet. By the way, a lot of style guides these days say internet with a small I. I follow those style guides, but there's some that still use a capital. It wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. Russian teachers notice such details. And then they correct me. Things like trade magazines can be very, very useful, or these days trade websites. Most professions have some kind of websites. Do have a look at them. And of course, talking to your colleagues who teach the core subjects is very important, whatever you're using, that you liaise. Just so you know, we also do provide, if you're not familiar with them, we do provide a very wide range of books. If you are interested, you can ask us afterwards. These ones, and these ones, and more. You've got taxi drivers here. There's a whole chapter on being politically offensive. complaining about lots of different people. We also have things on things like cooking, and we'll bring out, oh gosh, there's a couple more that are coming out that are quite interesting as well. Nutrition, kindergarten, teachers, we have a whole bunch of them. What I wanted to do in this presentation is not, I'm happy that you're aware that they exist, but importantly, I wanted you to know that the process we went through was a genuine one. Because what we did is we worked with authors, co-authors who were essentially just the experts who gave us information on the kinds of things that are done in the language, and then we had to, from our side, shape it into something that would work educationally. Because the people who are experts in the field are not necessarily teachers of language. So we put together a course, just going to show you a few of them. Animal health. I'm not quite sure what he's doing to that cow. I'm not going to ask. But you see what you've got here is what we had to go through this whole process. This is design, making things, materials, properties, etc. This one is IT. It's for people who sit in dark rooms a lot and probably don't have girlfriends. Things like hotel management, etc. If you are interested, please do ask about it. I'm not going to talk about those anymore now. The general points about methodology are general points. There has been a big shift. We were made aware of that as we went through. The points I mentioned are valid, and I would now very much like to hand you over to my colleague. Who's speaking now? Yes? Marina? Yes. For a few minutes, Marina from Prosiedzenie would just like to talk to you for a few minutes. I shall thank you very much for your attention and for staying awake after lunch, which is very kind of you. And then I'll be seeing, if you wish, later on this afternoon, I'll be talking about CLIL and sharing some ideas about that, and also showing you at the end of that just a little bit of something that we made, the CLIL applications, etc. But I want to focus on issues with CLIL in the modern classroom, and you're very welcome to join should